Imagine being trapped at the top of a spruce tree in Alaska's brutal winter, with temperatures plunging to -64 degrees Celsius. No shelter, no food, just you, the howling wind, and a survival instinct that refuses to give up. This is the true story of Marcus Chen, a wildlife photographer whose routine expedition turned into an unimaginable fight for survival. What he did to stay alive will leave you stunned. Before we begin, if you enjoy this type of content, leave a like to support the channel. Marcus Chen had photographed grizzly bears in Katmai, tracked wolves through Denali, and documented the migration patterns of caribou across the tundra. At 34 years old, he considered himself experienced enough to handle Alaska's wilderness. But experience, as he would soon learn, meant nothing when nature decided to test you beyond your limits. It was January 2024 when Marcus set out from Fairbanks into the White Mountains National Recreation Area. His plan was straightforward: a 5-day solo expedition to photograph the northern lights interacting with the winter landscape. He'd done similar trips dozens of times. His truck was loaded with cold weather gear, emergency supplies, and enough camera equipment to capture the aurora borealis in all its glory. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. Marcus hiked through pristine snow, the crystalline landscape stretching endlessly beneath impossibly clear skies. At night, he set up his tripod and watched the green ribbons of light dance across the darkness. His camera clicked steadily, capturing images that would make any nature magazine proud. The temperature hovered around -40 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, but manageable with proper gear. On the third morning, Marcus noticed the sky changing. The brilliant blue was giving way to a murky grey, and the wind had picked up significantly. He checked his weather radio, but the forecast had been relatively mild when he'd last received an update. Still, something felt wrong. The air had that heavy, expectant quality that seasoned outdoorsmen learn to recognize. By noon, the first snowflakes began to fall. Within an hour, it had become a full blizzard. Marcus quickly set up his emergency tent, staking it down as securely as possible in the deepening snow. The wind screamed around him, and visibility dropped to nearly zero. This wasn't the gentle snowfall he'd anticipated. This was a white monster, the kind of storm that old-timers in Fairbanks talked about in hushed tones. Marcus huddled in his tent, his sleeping bag pulled tight around him, listening to the fabric strain against the wind. He heated water on his portable stove and ate a freeze-dried meal, trying to stay calm. Storms passed. He just needed to wait it out. But this storm had other plans. Around midnight, Marcus heard a sound that made his blood run cold, a deep, ominous crack, followed by a thunderous roar. Before he could react, something massive slammed into his tent, collapsing it completely. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs and pinned him beneath layers of fabric and an enormous weight. Panic surged through him as he struggled to breathe, to move, to understand what had happened. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Marcus managed to create a small air pocket and extract his headlamp from his jacket pocket. The LED beam revealed his nightmare. A massive tree, snapped by the wind and weighted down by ice, had fallen directly onto his tent. The crushing weight made movement nearly impossible. His left arm was pinned, and he could feel the cold seeping through his multiple layers. With his free right hand, Marcus began the desperate work of trying to dig himself out. Every handful of snow he scooped away seemed to be replaced by 2 more as the blizzard continued its assault. Time lost all meaning in that frozen darkness. Marcus dug, rested, dug again. His fingers went numb despite his gloves. His shoulders screamed in protest. But the survival instinct that had carried him through so many wilderness challenges kept him moving, kept him fighting. After what he later estimated was 3 hours, Marcus finally created an opening large enough to squeeze through. He emerged into a world transformed into pure chaos. The blizzard was at full fury now, the wind so strong he could barely stand. Snow flew horizontally, stinging any exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. The temperature had dropped even further, and his weather gauge showed -58 degrees Celsius. Marcus tried to return to his collapsed tent to retrieve his supplies, but the fallen tree made it impossible. Most of his gear, his sleeping bag, his stove, his food supplies, his emergency beacon, was buried beneath tons of wood and ice. He managed to grab his backpack, which had been near the tent entrance, and discovered it contained only his camera equipment, one water bottle, and a small emergency kit with matches, a knife, and a space blanket. The realization of his situation hit him like a physical blow. He was trapped in one of the worst blizzards Alaska had seen in decades, with minimal supplies, no shelter, and no way to call for help. The temperature was continuing to drop, and he knew from experience that once it hit -60, exposed skin could freeze in under a minute. If you're enjoying this story so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Marcus knew he had to find shelter immediately. In whiteout conditions, he could barely see 5 feet ahead, but staying still meant death. He began moving, using his compass to head toward where he remembered seeing a cluster of trees earlier. Dense trees could provide some windbreak at least. Each step was a battle against the wind. Snow had already accumulated above his knees, and every movement required tremendous effort. His face was completely covered except for his eyes, which he kept squinted against the stinging snow. The cold was no longer just uncomfortable, it was actively hostile, searching for any gap in his defenses. After stumbling for what felt like miles, but was probably only a few hundred yards, Marcus's headlamp beam finally revealed what he'd been hoping for: a stand of dense spruce trees. Their branches, heavy with snow and ice, created a slightly calmer pocket in the storm's fury. But as he approached, disaster struck again. His foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow, and he pitched forward. Marcus felt his ankle twist violently, heard a sickening pop, and collapsed face first into a snowdrift. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. When he tried to stand, his left ankle refused to bear any weight at all. Marcus pulled himself to a sitting position against one of the spruce trees, breathing hard, fighting back the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. He was injured, isolated, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. As he sat there trying to assess his options, Marcus looked up through the branches of the tree he was leaning against. Despite everything, despite the pain and fear and cold, his photographer's eye noticed something. The spruce was old and massive, with branches spreading out like the levels of a natural ladder. Its dense needles, loaded with snow, had created a surprisingly thick canopy above. An idea began to form in his mind. It was crazy. It defied everything he knew about winter survival. Conventional wisdom said to stay low, to conserve heat, to find ground-level shelter. But conventional wisdom hadn't accounted for a blizzard this severe or temperatures this extreme. Marcus looked up at that tree and made a decision that would either save his life or end it. He was going to climb. With his injured ankle throbbing and the blizzard still raging around him, Marcus Chen began one of the most desperate climbs of his life. The decision seemed insane even to him. Climbing a tree in the middle of an Arctic blizzard with a potentially broken ankle. But the alternative was sitting at the base and slowly freezing to death as the snow buried him. The lowest branches of the old spruce were about 6 feet off the ground, just barely within reach. Using his good leg and his upper body strength, Marcus pulled himself up, ignoring the screaming protest from his injured ankle. Each movement sent waves of pain through his leg, but adrenaline and determination kept him moving. The branches were thick and sturdy at least. This tree had probably stood for over 100 years. Marcus worked his way up methodically, testing each branch before trusting it with his full weight. His injured ankle dangled uselessly, and he had to rely entirely on his arms and his one good leg. Snow and ice caked his clothing. His fingers, even inside his gloves, were losing feeling. But as he climbed higher, Marcus noticed something remarkable. The wind's fury was diminishing. The dense network of branches was acting as a natural windbreak, and the heavy snow accumulation on the needles created an almost umbrella-like effect above him. 20 feet up, Marcus found what he'd been hoping for, a natural platform where several thick branches converged at the trunk. The space was roughly 4 feet across, just wide enough for him to sit with his legs extended. More importantly, the canopy of branches above created a pocket that was noticeably calmer than the chaos below. Marcus carefully positioned himself on this natural platform, wedging his back against the trunk and wrapping his arms around a sturdy branch for security. He pulled out his space blanket, a thin sheet of reflective material from his emergency kit, and wrapped it around himself as best he could in the confined space. The relief of being out of the direct wind was immediate and profound. While he could still hear the storm howling around him and feel the trees swaying in the gusts, the worst of the wind's bite was blocked by the dense branches. The temperature was still lethally cold, but without the wind chill factor, it was marginally more survivable. Marcus checked his watch. 3:47 a.m. He'd been fighting for survival for over 5 hours. His body was exhausted, his ankle was swelling inside his boot, and he knew hypothermia was stalking him like a patient predator. But for the first moment since the tree had crushed his tent, he felt like he might actually have a chance. As the adrenaline began to fade, the cold started to truly set in. Marcus knew the danger signs. The shivering that had been violent was now becoming sporadic, a bad sign indicating his body was losing the battle to maintain core temperature. His thoughts were starting to feel sluggish. He needed to do something to generate heat. In his emergency kit, Marcus found a small package of hand warmers, chemical packs that activated when exposed to air. He had 4 of them. Following his survival training, he placed them strategically, one on his chest near his heart, one on his abdomen, and saved the other 2 for later. The warmth they provided was modest, but psychologically enormous. But Marcus knew hand warmers wouldn't be enough to survive temperatures that were now approaching minus 64 degrees Celsius. He needed to think, to use every resource available. His photographer's mind, trained to observe and problem-solve in challenging conditions, began to work through his situation methodically. He had the space blanket wrapped around him, reflecting some of his body heat back. He had the tree branches providing wind protection, but he needed more insulation, more protection from the cold that was trying to kill him. Looking around his perch, Marcus's eye fell on the snow-laden branches surrounding him. Snow, he remembered from his survival training, was actually an excellent insulator. Igloos worked because snow trapped air pockets that prevented heat loss. What if he could use the snow around him to create a similar effect? Moving carefully to avoid falling, Marcus began pulling snow from the surrounding branches and packing it around himself. He created a wall of snow on the windward side, building it up until it formed a crude barrier about 2 feet high. Then he pulled more snow over his legs, packing it around himself like a blanket. The work was exhausting and made his hands ache with cold, but as the snow structure took shape, Marcus noticed a difference. The makeshift snow wall was blocking even more of the residual wind, and the snow packed around his lower body was actually providing insulation. His core temperature wasn't rising, but it had stopped dropping as rapidly. Leave a comment about what you think of this survival strategy so far. As dawn slowly broke, though it was barely distinguishable through the blizzard, Marcus took stock of his resources. He had 1 water bottle, which was now frozen solid despite being in his pack. He had his camera equipment, which was useless for survival but represented his livelihood. He had the small emergency kit with matches, knife, and the remaining 2 hand warmers. And he had his wits and his will to survive. The matches sparked an idea. Fire was impossible in these conditions. Everything was covered in snow and ice, and the wind would extinguish any flame instantly. But what if he could create heat in a different way? Marcus carefully removed one of his camera's lithium batteries. These batteries, he knew, generated heat when they were active. He turned on his camera and placed it inside his jacket, using its operating heat to warm his core slightly. It wasn't much, but every bit counted. He had 3 spare batteries, giving him a way to generate small amounts of heat throughout the day. The pain in his ankle had evolved from sharp agony to a deep, throbbing ache. Marcus knew he needed to assess the damage, but he was afraid to remove his boot. The swelling would be significant, and in these temperatures, exposing the injury could lead to rapid frostbite. He decided to leave the boot on, using its compression to help stabilize whatever damage had occurred. As the morning progressed, the blizzard showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to intensify. Marcus could hear the wind shrieking through the forest, could feel the tree swaying beneath him. Occasionally, he'd hear the crack and crash of another tree falling somewhere in the distance. The isolation was almost as challenging as the cold. Marcus was completely alone, perched in a tree in one of the most remote parts of Alaska, with no way to communicate with anyone. His emergency beacon was buried under tons of wood and snow. His satellite phone had been in the tent's gear pocket, completely inaccessible. No one knew exactly where he was, and no one would start searching for him until he was at least 2 days overdue from his planned return. To keep his mind active and fight off the mental fog of hypothermia, Marcus began talking to himself, reviewing everything he knew about cold weather survival. He recited facts about hypothermia stages, about frostbite prevention, about the body's responses to extreme cold. He told himself stories of other survivors who had beaten impossible odds. Around noon, Marcus realized he was intensely thirsty. The frozen water bottle was useless, but he had an abundant supply of clean snow all around him. Using his body heat, he began melting small amounts of snow inside his space blanket, collecting the water in his mouth. It was a slow process, and eating snow directly would lower his core temperature, but melting it first with body heat made it safer. He rationed this carefully, taking tiny amounts throughout the day. Hunger was another challenge. Marcus had no food at all. Everything edible had been in his tent. His body was burning calories at an accelerated rate, trying to maintain core temperature, and he could feel his energy reserves depleting. But there was nothing he could do about it, except try to conserve energy and stay as still as possible. As afternoon wore into evening, Marcus developed a routine. Every hour, he would activate a fresh camera battery to generate a small amount of heat. He would do careful exercises with his upper body and his good leg, flexing muscles to generate warmth without expending too much energy. He would adjust his snow barriers, packing new snow where it had settled or blown away. He would talk to himself, sing songs, recite poetry, anything to keep his mind sharp. The space blanket, despite being thin, was proving to be one of his most valuable resources. By carefully positioning it to reflect his body heat back toward himself while keeping snow piled around his lower body for insulation, Marcus had created a microclimate that, while still dangerously cold, was survivable. But as the second night approached and temperatures prepared to plunge even lower, Marcus knew his greatest challenge was still ahead. He'd survived one night, but that had been on adrenaline and shock. Now exhausted, injured, dehydrated, and hungry, could he survive another? The tree creaked and swayed in the wind, and Marcus held on, whispering to himself, "Just make it to morning. Just make it to morning." The second night was when the real battle began, not just against the cold, but against his own mind. As darkness fell and temperatures dropped to their lowest point yet, Marcus Chen found himself fighting an enemy more insidious than the blizzard, the desire to simply give up and sleep. Hypothermia, Marcus knew from his training, didn't just attack the body. It attacked judgment, created euphoria, made death seem like a peaceful option. As his core temperature hovered dangerously close to the threshold where his body would begin shutting down non-essential functions, Marcus had to actively fight against the seductive whisper in his mind, telling him to close his eyes and rest. "Stay awake," he commanded himself, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Stay awake, stay awake, stay awake." He slapped his face with his gloved hands, but the cold had made his skin so numb he could barely feel it. He flexed his fingers inside his gloves, terrified that he'd lose them to frostbite. He wiggled his toes, or tried to. He couldn't feel them anymore at all, which sent a spike of panic through him that momentarily cleared his head. To stay conscious and alert, Marcus forced himself to take mental inventory of his life. He thought about his parents in San Francisco, his mother who always worried about his dangerous expeditions, his father who encouraged his adventurous spirit. He thought about his sister, Amy, a pediatric nurse in Seattle, with 2 kids he hadn't visited in over a year because he was always chasing the next perfect photograph. The guilt of that realization hit him hard. When was the last time he'd told his family he loved them? When was the last time he'd called his mother just to talk, not to ask for money or tell her about some new trip? His life had been so focused on capturing beauty through his lens that he'd forgotten to actually live among the people who loved him. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered into the darkness, speaking to his family, even though they were thousands of miles away and couldn't hear him. "I'm so sorry. If I get out of this, I'll do better. I promise I'll do better." The tree swayed violently in a particularly strong gust, and Marcus instinctively gripped the branches tighter. Below him he could hear the continuous crash and roar of the storm. Above him, the canopy of branches offered protection, but also trapped him. He was in a self-made prison 20 feet above the ground, unable to move, unable to escape. If you're finding this story gripping, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps the channel tremendously. As the hours crawled by, Marcus began to hallucinate. The wind's howl transformed into voices, sometimes his mother calling his name, sometimes his sister laughing, sometimes completely unfamiliar people having conversations just out of sight. Intellectually, he knew these were auditory hallucinations brought on by isolation, cold, and oxygen deprivation as his brain struggled to maintain function. But emotionally, they felt real. At one point, Marcus could have sworn he saw his college roommate, David, sitting on a branch across from him, casual as could be, asking about Marcus's latest photography project. Marcus found himself answering, having a full conversation before reality snapped back and he realized he was talking to empty air. "Get it together," he told himself firmly. "Hallucinations mean you're in trouble. Stay grounded. Stay here." To anchor himself to reality, Marcus began narrating everything he did out loud. "I'm adjusting the space blanket now. I'm adding more snow to the left side barrier. I'm activating another camera battery for warmth. The time is..." He checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. The temperature is minus 63 degrees Celsius. The ritual of speaking helped. It gave him a sense of purpose, a connection to reality. He started describing what he would photograph if he survived this. "The aftermath of the storm," he said. "The way ice forms on tree branches in geometric patterns. The specific quality of light just after a blizzard passes. The resilience of nature." Around 2 a.m., Marcus faced his darkest moment. A wave of exhaustion so profound washed over him that he simply couldn't fight it anymore. His eyes were closing despite every mental command to stay awake. His body was screaming for rest, for sleep, for release from the constant fight. In that moment, teetering on the edge of consciousness, Marcus's hand brushed against his camera. Despite everything, despite the fact that it had been draining its battery for body heat, he felt a sudden urge to look through it. With numb, fumbling fingers, he raised it to his eye and looked through the viewfinder at the storm-racked forest around him. What he saw took his breath away. Even through the darkness and the blowing snow, even with his vision compromised by cold and exhaustion, There was something hauntingly beautiful about the scene, the way the ice gleamed on the branches when his headlamp caught it, the texture of the snow accumulation, the raw, terrible power of nature on full display. Marcus snapped a photo, then another, and another. He had no idea if the camera was even functioning properly in these conditions, but the act of composing shots, of looking for beauty in the midst of his nightmare, sparked something inside him. This was who he was. This was what he did. He found beauty in harsh places, captured moments that others might miss, told stories through images. "This is my story," Marcus said aloud, his voice stronger. "I'm not dying in this tree. I'm surviving in this tree, and I'm going to tell this story." The photography session lasted perhaps 10 minutes before the cold forced him to put the camera away. But those 10 minutes had shifted something fundamental in Marcus's mindset. He was no longer just enduring, just surviving. He was documenting, witnessing, participating in something remarkable. As the third day dawned, though again it was barely lighter than the night had been, Marcus assessed his physical condition honestly. His ankle was definitely broken or very badly sprained. His fingers and toes were in danger of serious frostbite. He was severely dehydrated despite his snow-melting efforts. He hadn't eaten in over 48 hours. His body was consuming its own muscle and fat to generate heat, and he could feel how much weaker he'd become. But he was alive. Against all odds, huddled in a tree at -64 degrees Celsius, Marcus Chen was alive. The blizzard was finally showing signs of weakening. The wind was still strong, but the absolute fury of the previous 2 days had diminished. Visibility had improved from 0 to perhaps 50 feet. For the first time since the disaster began, Marcus could see beyond his immediate surroundings. The landscape looked alien, transformed. Snow had accumulated in massive drifts, some rising 15 feet high. Trees that had stood for centuries had been toppled like matchsticks. The world had been remade into something harsh and unforgiving, a testament to nature's absolute power. Marcus knew he needed to start thinking about rescue. When the storm finally cleared completely, he needed to be visible, needed to have a plan for attracting attention. But he also knew that leaving his tree perch while injured could be fatal. The temperature was still lethal, and without his carefully constructed microclimate, he'd likely succumb to hypothermia within hours. So he waited, conserved his energy, kept his mind active by planning. He reviewed his knowledge of search and rescue procedures. In Alaska, when someone didn't return from a wilderness expedition on schedule, authorities would typically wait 24-48 hours before initiating a search, allowing for reasonable delays. Marcus had been due back in Fairbanks yesterday, which meant search efforts would probably begin soon. But finding him would be another challenge entirely. The storm would have covered all his tracks. His truck was parked at a trailhead, but the White Mountains National Recreation Area covered over 1 million acres. Without his emergency beacon, searchers would have to cover vast amounts of territory. Marcus needed to make himself visible. He thought about his bright orange emergency tarp that was buried with his tent, useless now. His space blanket was reflective but small. His camera equipment included various colored straps and bags, but nothing large enough to serve as an effective signal. Then his eyes fell on his space blanket again, and an idea formed. If he could secure it to the upper branches of his tree, positioned to catch sunlight, the reflective surface might be visible from the air. It was a long shot, but it was something. As the day progressed and the storm continued to weaken, Marcus began the careful, painful work of climbing higher into the tree. Every movement was agony with his injured ankle, but he forced himself upward, carrying his space blanket. 25 feet up, then 30, he found exposed upper branches where the canopy was thinner. Using paracord from his emergency kit and his belt, Marcus secured the space blanket as best he could, spreading it across several branches so it formed a roughly 6-foot square of reflective material. From the ground, it might not be visible, But from the air, if a search plane happened to pass over, it might catch a pilot's eye. The effort exhausted him completely, and climbing back down to his perch was even harder than going up. By the time he settled back into his spot, Marcus was trembling with exhaustion and pain. But he'd done something proactive. He'd taken action to improve his chances, and that felt like a victory. On the fourth day in the tree, Marcus Chen woke, if you could call his semi-conscious state sleeping, to silence. The absence of sound was so profound after 3 days of constant wind that it took him several moments to process it. The blizzard had finally passed. Pale sunlight filtered through the branches, the first direct sunlight Marcus had seen since the storm began. The temperature was still dangerously cold. His watch showed -51 degrees Celsius, but without the wind, it felt almost mild in comparison. The storm had moved on, leaving behind a transformed world. From his perch, Marcus could see the devastation the blizzard had wrought. Entire sections of forest had been flattened. Snow drifts rose higher than houses. The landscape looked like something from another planet, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Marcus's physical condition had deteriorated significantly. His water supply was nearly exhausted. His body was eating itself for fuel, and he suspected serious frostbite in his toes and several fingers. His injured ankle had swollen so much that his boot felt like it was cutting off circulation. But his mind was clearer now. The immediate crisis having passed, he needed to signal for help. With the storm cleared, search planes could fly. Marcus spent the morning adjusting his improvised signal, ensuring the space blanket was positioned to catch maximum sunlight. He also used branches to create a large X pattern in the snow below his tree, the universal signal for distress. The work was exhausting, but it gave him purpose. Every few minutes, Marcus would scan the sky, hoping to see or hear an aircraft. The silence of the wilderness was complete now, broken only by the occasional crack of ice or the soft thump of snow falling from overladen branches. Around noon, Marcus heard something that made his heart leap, the distant sound of an engine. It was faint, barely audible but unmistakable, an aircraft, probably a search plane, somewhere to the east. Marcus began yelling, screaming as loud as his weakened body would allow, even though he knew the plane was too far away to hear him. He waved his arms, tried to create movement that might catch a pilot's eye, but the sound faded, moving away, and Marcus slumped back against the tree trunk, tears freezing on his cheeks. They were looking for him. That knowledge was both comforting and agonizing. Searchers were out there, but they hadn't spotted him yet. He was a tiny speck in over 1 million acres of wilderness, and finding him would be like finding a needle in a haystack. Over the next several hours, Marcus heard 2 more aircraft pass in the distance. Each time, he did everything possible to attract attention. But each time, the sounds faded without any indication that he'd been seen. As afternoon wore into evening, Marcus forced himself to think logically. The search would continue tomorrow. He needed to survive 1 more night, maintain his signal, and increase his visibility. His camera had 1 remaining battery, and Marcus used it to take photos of his situation, his makeshift shelter, his snow barriers. If he survived, these would tell his story. If he didn't, perhaps someone would find the camera and understand what he'd tried to do. The 5th day dawned clear and brutally cold. Marcus's condition was critical now. He could no longer feel most of his extremities. His thinking was slow, muddled. He knew he was approaching the limit of what the human body could endure. Without food, water, and proper warmth, even his ingenuity and determination couldn't keep him alive much longer. But around 10 a.m., Marcus heard the most beautiful sound of his life, the distinct rhythmic thump of a helicopter, and it was getting closer. With the last of his strength, Marcus began waving his arms, screaming, doing anything to make himself visible. The helicopter was definitely heading in his direction, flying a grid search pattern. Closer, closer, and then it passed directly overhead. Marcus saw a figure in the helicopter's window, saw binoculars being raised, saw the helicopter banked sharply, circling back. They'd seen him. They'd actually seen him. Marcus collapsed back against the tree trunk, overcome with emotion. Tears streamed down his face as the helicopter hovered nearby, too large to land in the dense forest, but clearly communicating that help had arrived. Within minutes, a rescue swimmer was being lowered on a cable through the trees. The man's voice was the first human sound Marcus had heard in 5 days. "Marcus, Chen, we've got you, buddy. You're safe now." The rescue was technically complex. Getting an injured man down from a tree and into a helicopter in extreme cold required careful coordination. But the rescue crew worked with practiced efficiency. They secured Marcus in a harness, stabilized his ankle, and began the careful process of lifting him up through the branches. As Marcus rose above his shelter, he looked down at the tree that had saved his life. The snow barriers he'd built, the branches that had protected him, the natural platform that had been his home for 5 days. Against all logic, against all conventional wisdom, that tree had been exactly what he needed. The helicopter ride to the hospital in Fairbanks was a blur. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness as medical personnel worked on him. He heard fragments of conversation. Core temperature 93.4, frostbite damage moderate, broken left ankle. Remarkable, he survived 5 days. At the hospital, Marcus learned the full extent of his ordeal. He'd lost the tips of 3 fingers and 2 toes to frostbite. His ankle was indeed broken. He'd lost nearly 20 pounds. But he'd survived temperatures that should have killed him, survived without shelter, food, or water in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The rescue coordinator visited him the next day, shaking his head in amazement. "When we found you, the temperature was minus 56 degrees Celsius. You were up in that tree for 5 full days, in the worst blizzard this region has seen in 40 years. By every calculation, you should have died the first night." "The tree saved me," Marcus said. "Getting up off the ground, out of the wind, using the snow for insulation, it created a microclimate that was just barely survivable." "It was ingenious," the coordinator agreed, "and completely counterintuitive. Most people in your situation would have tried to stay low, conserve energy, but you did something different." Marcus smiled weakly. "I didn't have a choice. Sometimes the illogical solution is the only solution." News of Marcus's survival spread quickly. His story captured people's imagination. The photographer who survived impossible conditions by climbing a tree. Survival experts analyzed his techniques, some praising his innovation, others pointing out how easily it could have ended differently. But Marcus knew the truth. He'd survived through a combination of knowledge, creativity, determination, and extraordinary luck. The tree had been the right species, in the right location, with the right structure. The storm had been severe enough to require drastic measures, but not severe enough to break his tree. His injuries had been disabling, but not fatal. 1,000 small factors had aligned to give him just enough of a chance. 3 months later, Marcus returned to the White Mountains. His ankle had healed, though he walked with a slight limp. His abbreviated fingers had adapted surprisingly well, and he was determined to photograph the tree that had saved his life. When he found it, GPS coordinates made that easy. Marcus stood looking up at the branches that had been his home and nearly his tomb. Snow still clung to the upper reaches, and his space blanket signal, tattered but intact, still fluttered in the breeze. Marcus set up his camera and began shooting, capturing the tree from every angle. But he also did something else. He placed a small metal plaque at its base, bolted into the bark. "Here I survived, thanks to nature's shelter. February 2024, MC." As he prepared to leave, Marcus took one last photograph, framing the tree against the blue Alaska sky. It was just a tree, one of millions in the wilderness, but it had been his refuge, his fortress, his unlikely savior. Sometimes survival defies logic. Sometimes the answer to impossible situations lies not in following the rules, but in seeing the world differently, in recognizing that nature, harsh and unforgiving as it can be, also provides solutions if you're creative enough to find them. Marcus Chen had found his solution 20 feet up, in the branches of an old spruce tree, in temperatures that should have killed him. And he'd lived to tell the tale. The days following Marcus Chen's rescue were filled with painful medical procedures and difficult adjustments. At Providence, Alaska Medical Center in Fairbanks, a team of specialists worked to save what they could of his frostbitten extremities and repair his broken ankle. Dr. Sarah Wellington, the hospital's leading expert on cold weather injuries, explained the extent of the damage during Marcus's second day of hospitalization. "You're incredibly fortunate," she told him, reviewing the x-rays and scans. "When the rescue team brought you in, your core temperature was 93.4 degrees Fahrenheit, just above the threshold for severe hypothermia. Another hour or two and we'd be having a very different conversation." The frostbite damage, while significant, was far less catastrophic than it could have been. Marcus would lose the distal portions of his left index and middle fingers, along with his right pinky finger, about half an inch from each. 2 toes on his left foot would also require partial amputation. The procedures were performed over several surgeries during his first week in the hospital. "The remarkable thing," Dr. Wellington continued, "is how you managed to protect your core. Most of the frostbite damage is peripheral, which suggests you did an excellent job of prioritizing blood flow to vital organs. That microclimate you created in the tree, it was the difference between minor injuries and death." Marcus's family arrived on the second day. His mother, Maria, couldn't stop crying as she held his remaining fingers. His father, David Sr., stood stoic but emotional at the foot of the bed. His sister Amy, true to her nursing nature, immediately began asking the medical staff technical questions about his treatment plan. "I thought we'd lost you," Maria whispered, stroking his hair. "When the rangers called to say you hadn't checked in, that they'd found your truck but you were missing in that storm, I thought we'd lost you." "I'm here, Mom," Marcus replied, his voice still raspy from days of screaming into the wind. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." During his 2-week hospital stay, Marcus became something of a celebrity. Local news stations wanted interviews. National magazines requested his story. Fellow photographers and outdoor enthusiasts reached out with messages of support and amazement. But Marcus found the attention overwhelming. He wasn't ready to process what had happened, let alone explain it to strangers. Physical therapy began almost immediately. Learning to walk with an altered gait, adjusting to missing fingers, managing the chronic pain that came with severe cold weather injuries. It was all part of a long recovery process. The physical therapist, Jake Morrison, was a former wilderness guide who understood the psychological as well as physical challenges Marcus faced. "A lot of people who survive extreme situations develop PTSD, Jake explained during one session. The body heals faster than the mind sometimes. Don't be surprised if you have nightmares, anxiety, or unexpected emotional responses. It's all part of the process." Jake's prediction proved accurate. Marcus had vivid nightmares almost every night. Dreams of being trapped in the tree as it fell, of the cold seeping through his defenses, of rescue helicopters that flew past without seeing him. He woke frequently in panic, momentarily confused about where he was, expecting to see ice-covered branches instead of hospital walls. 6 weeks after the rescue, Marcus was discharged from the hospital with a detailed rehabilitation plan, pain medications, and a referral to a trauma counselor. His parents wanted him to come to San Francisco to recover, but Marcus insisted on returning to his apartment in Anchorage. He needed familiar surroundings, needed to prove to himself that he could still function independently. The counselor, Dr. Rebecca Cho, specialized in treating survivors of wilderness accidents. In their first session, she explained, "What you experienced wasn't just physically traumatic, it was existentially challenging. You confronted mortality in its rawest form. Many survivors struggle with questions of purpose, meaning, why they lived when others in similar situations have died. These are normal responses to extraordinary circumstances. Marcus found himself thinking constantly about the randomness of his survival. If the tree had fallen 3 feet to the left, it would have missed his tent. If he'd chosen a different campsite, he wouldn't have been near the spruce that saved him. If the blizzard had been even slightly worse, his makeshift shelter wouldn't have been sufficient. The thin margin between life and death haunted him. 3 months post-rescue, Marcus attempted to return to photography work. His first assignment was a simple job, photographing a hotel in downtown Anchorage for a travel magazine. But even this straightforward task proved challenging. His abbreviated fingers made handling camera equipment awkward. He'd adapted to using his remaining digits, but the muscle memory of his old grip was gone, requiring him to relearn basic techniques. More troubling was his psychological response to being outdoors. As soon as Marcus stepped out into the cold February air, a relatively mild -15 degrees Celsius, he felt panic rising in his chest. His breathing became rapid and shallow. His heart raced. He found himself constantly checking the weather, obsessing over temperature fluctuations, unable to trust the environment that had nearly killed him. This is classical post-traumatic stress, Dr. Cho explained when he described the experience. Your nervous system learned that cold environments are life-threatening. It's going to take time to retrain those responses, to help your body understand that normal cold weather isn't the same as the extreme conditions you survived. The recovery process was slow and frustrating. Marcus threw himself into physical therapy, determined to regain as much function as possible. He practiced camera techniques for hours, adapting his grip, learning new ways to adjust settings with his modified hands. He forced himself to spend increasingly longer periods outside, gradually desensitizing himself to cold weather. But the psychological healing was more complex. Marcus found himself questioning everything about his career and life choices. Why did he take such risks? What was he trying to prove? Was capturing the perfect photograph worth potentially dying alone in the wilderness? His relationship with photography had changed fundamentally. Before the accident, Marcus had pursued beauty and perfection in nature with single-minded determination. He'd take any risk, endure any hardship, to get the shot he envisioned. Now every decision was filtered through the lens of survival and safety. Maybe that's not a bad thing, his sister Amy suggested during one of her visits to Anchorage. Maybe being a little more cautious, a little more aware of risks, makes you wiser, not weaker. 4 months after the rescue, Marcus received an unexpected package. Inside was a letter from the helicopter pilot who had spotted him, Captain Jennifer Walsh of the Alaska Air National Guard. "Dear Marcus," the letter read, "I wanted to write to you about the day we found you. We'd been searching for 3 days, flying grid patterns over an enormous area. Honestly, after that long in those conditions, we weren't expecting to find you alive. When my co-pilot spotted that reflective material in the tree, we almost didn't investigate. It could have been anything, natural reflection off ice, a piece of debris. But something made me circle back. When I saw you waving from up in those branches, I couldn't believe it. In 15 years of search and rescue, I'd never seen anything like it. Your survival wasn't just luck or even skill. It was extraordinary problem-solving under impossible pressure. You should be proud of what you accomplished. You found a solution where there shouldn't have been one. That's remarkable." Marcus read the letter multiple times, feeling something shift inside him. Captain Walsh was right. He had solved an impossible problem. Instead of seeing his survival as random luck, maybe he could view it as a testament to human adaptability and ingenuity. This reframing helped Marcus begin to process his experience differently. Rather than being haunted by how close he'd come to dying, he started to appreciate the resourcefulness he'd demonstrated. The tree shelter wasn't a desperate last resort. It was creative problem-solving. His snow barriers weren't crude survival techniques. They were innovative applications of thermodynamic principles. 5 months post-rescue, Marcus made a decision. He would write a book about his experience, but not just a survival memoir. He wanted to create something that examined the psychology of extreme situations, the science of cold weather survival, and the broader questions about risk, nature, and human resilience. The writing process became therapeutic. By analyzing what had happened, researching the meteorological conditions, interviewing survival experts, and documenting his emotional journey, Marcus transformed his trauma into something meaningful. The book project gave structure to his recovery and purpose to his survival. As spring arrived in Alaska and temperatures warmed, Marcus noticed his anxiety about cold weather gradually diminishing. He could wear light jackets without panic. He could stand outside in -10 degrees Celsius and appreciate the crisp air instead of fearing it. His nervous system was slowly recalibrating, learning that cold could be manageable, even pleasant, not just deadly. 6 months after the rescue, Marcus accepted a photography assignment in Denali National Park, his first return to wilderness work. His family was worried, but Marcus felt ready. This time, he traveled with a partner, carried multiple emergency beacons, filed detailed itineraries, and checked weather forecasts obsessively. His approach to wilderness photography had changed, become more measured and safety-conscious, but he was doing it again. Standing in Denali, camera in hand, Marcus realized something profound. The accident hadn't ended his career or his passion. It had refined them. He was still the same photographer who sought beauty in harsh landscapes, but now he understood the true cost of that pursuit. He'd always respected nature's power intellectually. Now he understood it viscerally. While Marcus focused on his physical and emotional recovery, another process was unfolding: the official investigation into his accident. The Alaska Department of Public Safety, in conjunction with the National Weather Service and the White Mountains National Recreation Area Management, conducted a thorough review of what had happened and why. Ranger Thomas Blackwood, who led the investigation, visited Marcus at his Anchorage apartment 2 months after the rescue. "We need to understand what happened," Thomas explained, setting up a recording device. "Not to assign blame, but to learn. Your case is extraordinary. Someone surviving that long in those conditions. If we can understand what worked and what didn't, it might help others in the future." Marcus walked Thomas through every decision, every action, from the moment he'd set out from Fairbanks. The ranger took detailed notes, asked clarifying questions, and reviewed Marcus's remaining gear, which had been recovered from the collapsed tent site after the storm cleared. "The tree that fell on your tent," Thomas said, examining photographs of the scene, was a 70-foot white spruce, approximately 120 years old. The storm winds reached sustained speeds of 85 miles per hour, with gusts up to 110. The combination of high winds and ice accumulation on the branches caused catastrophic failure. We found 17 other trees in the immediate area that fell during the same storm. The investigation revealed that the blizzard Marcus had been caught in was a once-in-40-years event. Meteorologist Dr. Linda Chen from the National Weather Service explained the storm's unusual characteristics during her interview with Marcus. "What you experienced was a perfect storm, literally," Dr. Chen said. "A low-pressure system from the Bering Sea collided with Arctic air masses in a way that created unprecedented conditions. The rapid temperature drop, the wind velocity, the duration, all of these factors combined to make this one of the most severe winter storms in Alaskan records." The temperature data was particularly striking. During Marcus's 5 days in the tree, temperatures had ranged from -56 to -64 degrees Celsius. Wind chill values had been even more extreme, reaching -80 degrees Celsius at times. These were temperatures that exceeded even the limits that military cold weather training prepared soldiers for. Dr. Mitchell Stevens, a survival expert from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, was brought in to analyze Marcus's survival techniques. His assessment was fascinating. What Mr. Chen did was counterintuitive but scientifically sound, Dr. Stevens explained in his report. By elevating himself into the tree canopy, he achieved several things. First, he escaped the worst of the ground-level wind chill. Wind speeds typically decrease with height in forested areas. Second, he created a microclimate using the tree's natural structure and snow accumulation. The dense branches acted as a windbreak, and the snow he packed around himself provided insulation. Snow is actually an excellent insulator because of the air pockets it contains. Third, he minimized ground contact, which is crucial. The ground can suck heat from a body incredibly quickly in extreme cold. By staying off the ground entirely, he reduced conductive heat loss significantly. Dr. Stevens' analysis included calculations showing that Marcus's tree shelter had effectively raised the ambient temperature in his immediate vicinity by approximately 8 to 10 degrees Celsius compared to ground level. This difference, combined with reduced wind exposure, had been the critical factor in his survival. The investigation also examined Marcus's equipment and preparedness. His cold weather gear was professional grade and appropriate for the conditions he'd expected to encounter. His emergency kit, while basic, had contained the essentials. The failure point hadn't been his equipment or planning. It had been the unprecedented severity of the storm and the catastrophic bad luck of having a tree fall on his tent. Mr. Chen did nothing wrong, Ranger Blackwood concluded in his official report. His preparations were adequate for typical winter conditions in the White Mountains. The storm that trapped him was exceptional and unpredictable. His survival demonstrates both the value of proper preparation and the importance of adaptive thinking in crisis situations. However, the investigation did make several recommendations based on Marcus's experience. First, they recommended that solo winter expeditions in remote areas should be discouraged but not prohibited. If undertaken, multiple emergency communication devices should be mandatory, with at least one kept on the person rather than in a tent or pack. Second, they suggested improvements to weather forecasting and warning systems for remote areas. The rapid intensification of the blizzard that trapped Marcus had given him very little warning time. Better real-time weather data could help prevent similar situations. Third, they recommended enhanced training in improvised shelter construction for winter wilderness users. Marcus's tree shelter, while born of desperation, demonstrated principles that could be taught and practiced. The investigation attracted attention from survival training organizations worldwide. The British SAS cold weather survival instructors requested copies of the report. The Norwegian military's Arctic Warfare School incorporated Marcus's tree shelter technique into their training scenarios. The Canadian Rangers updated their survival manuals to include analysis of his experience. Marcus found himself invited to speak at survival training conferences and outdoor education symposiums. Initially reluctant, he eventually agreed to share his story, feeling an obligation to contribute to others' safety and preparation. At his first presentation to a group of wilderness guides in Colorado, Marcus was nervous, but as he walked the audience through his experience, showing photographs and explaining his decision-making process, he found a receptive and respectful audience. "The key thing I want you to understand," Marcus told them, "is that I didn't survive because I'm special or heroic. I survived because I refused to accept that there was no solution. When the conventional options, staying in my collapsed tent, trying to hike out, weren't viable, I looked for unconventional ones. The tree wasn't an obvious shelter, but it turned out to be the right shelter for those specific conditions." A guide in the audience asked, "Would you recommend your technique to others in similar situations?" Marcus thought carefully before answering. I'd recommend the principle behind my technique: creative problem solving, using available resources, understanding basic physics and thermodynamics. But every survival situation is unique. What worked for me might not work for someone else. The broader lesson is, don't give up just because the textbook solutions aren't available. Look at what you have, where you are, what's possible. The investigation's findings were published in several academic journals, including the Journal of Wilderness Medicine and the International Journal of Circumpolar Health. Marcus's case became a teaching example, studied by medical students learning about hypothermia, by meteorologists studying extreme weather events, and by survival instructors worldwide. But perhaps the most significant outcome of the investigation was its impact on search and rescue procedures. The Alaska Air National Guard revised their search protocols based on lessons from Marcus's rescue, particularly regarding the importance of systematic grid searches and the need to investigate even unlikely signals or indicators of human presence. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the pilot who had spotted Marcus, advocated for improved training in visual search techniques. "We almost missed him," she told her superiors. "That reflective material in the tree could have been anything. We need to train searchers to look for the unlikely, the out of place, the things that don't quite fit the natural environment." 8 months after the accident, the White Mountains National Recreation Area installed a memorial at the trailhead where Marcus had begun his expedition. The plaque read, "In January 2024, photographer Marcus Chen survived 5 days in extreme conditions following an unprecedented winter storm. His resourcefulness and determination serve as a reminder of both the dangers of Alaska's wilderness and the resilience of the human spirit." Visitors are reminded to prepare thoroughly, check weather conditions, carry multiple emergency communication devices, and never underestimate nature's power. Marcus attended the dedication ceremony, walking with a slight limp, but walking nonetheless. As he stood before the memorial, he felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in his survival, sadness for the permanent changes to his body, gratitude for those who had saved him, and a renewed respect for the wilderness that had both nearly killed him and ultimately sheltered him. "Thank you for this," Marcus said to the assembled rangers and officials. "But I hope no one else ever needs to use the survival techniques I used. I hope everyone who ventures into these mountains comes home safely, without incident. My story is exceptional, and I'd rather it remained an exception." A year after his rescue, Marcus Chen stood once again in the White Mountains National Recreation Area, but this time under vastly different circumstances. The summer sun warmed his face as he led a group of outdoor photography students on a workshop expedition. His abbreviated fingers operated his camera with practiced ease. He'd adapted his technique so thoroughly that most people never noticed his modified grip. "The key to wildlife photography," Marcus explained to his students, "is patience and respect. We're visitors in their home. We observe, we document, but we never intrude." This was Marcus's new direction: education rather than solitary wilderness expeditions. He'd discovered that teaching brought him more satisfaction than chasing the perfect shot ever had. Sharing knowledge, helping others develop their skills, creating a community of responsible outdoor enthusiasts. This felt more meaningful than adding another photograph to his portfolio. The photography workshop was part of a broader program Marcus had developed called Survival Through the Lens, which combined wilderness photography instruction with comprehensive safety training. Each participant learned not just how to capture stunning images, but how to prepare for emergencies, recognize dangerous weather patterns, and make smart decisions in the backcountry. "Before we talk about composition and lighting," Marcus told each new group, "we're going to talk about survival, because the best photograph in the world isn't worth your life." His book, -64, A Photographer's Survival Story, had been published 6 months earlier to critical acclaim. It wasn't just a survival memoir, but a thoughtful exploration of risk, decision-making, and the psychological aspects of facing mortality. The book included detailed scientific analysis of cold weather survival, interviews with the people involved in his rescue, and honest discussion of his recovery and ongoing challenges. Reviewers praised the book's balance of gripping narrative and practical information. Outside Magazine called it essential reading for anyone who ventures into winter wilderness. The New York Times review noted, Chen transforms his near-death experience into a meditation on human adaptability and the thin line between adventure and catastrophe. The book's success brought unexpected opportunities. Marcus was invited to speak at TEDx events, interviewed on major podcasts, and consulted for television programs about wilderness survival. But he was careful about which opportunities he accepted, selective about how his story was used. "I don't want to be famous for almost dying," Marcus explained to his agent. "I want to contribute something meaningful. If my experience can help people make better decisions, prepare more thoroughly, or understand the realities of extreme environments, then it's worth sharing. But I'm not interested in sensationalism." One of the most meaningful projects Marcus undertook was working with the Alaska Department of Education to develop wilderness safety curriculum for high school students. Alaska, with its vast wilderness and outdoor-oriented culture, saw regular tragedies involving young people who underestimated nature's dangers. Marcus's curriculum combined respect for the outdoors with practical safety skills. "Alaska is beautiful," Marcus told students during a pilot presentation of the curriculum. "It's an incredible place to live and explore, but it will kill you if you're not careful. Not because it's malicious, but because nature operates by its own rules. Your job is to learn those rules, respect them, and make smart decisions." His romantic relationship status had changed too. Marcus had started dating Emily Harrison, a wilderness emergency medicine instructor he'd met during his recovery. She understood his experiences in ways few others could, having treated numerous cold weather injuries and hypothermia cases during her career. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, shared values about outdoor safety, and Emily's patient support as Marcus continued processing his trauma. "She gets it," Marcus told his sister Amy. "When I have nightmares or anxiety attacks, she doesn't try to fix me or tell me I should be over it by now. She just sits with me, grounds me, reminds me that I'm safe." Emily had been crucial in helping Marcus return to winter photography. Their first joint winter expedition, a carefully planned 3-day trip to photograph ice formations in the Chugach Mountains, had been emotionally challenging for Marcus, but ultimately healing. Having a skilled partner who understood both his capabilities and his triggers made all the difference. The physical limitations from his frostbite injuries had become less significant over time. Marcus had learned to type efficiently with his modified hands, had adapted his camera grip, and had even regained more dexterity than doctors initially expected. The missing toe portions affected his balance slightly, but regular physical therapy and adaptation had minimized the impact. "Bodies are remarkably adaptable," his physical therapist Jake told him during one of their final sessions. "You've done the work to retrain muscle memory, to develop compensation strategies. At this point, your limitations are probably less significant than you think." The chronic pain from cold weather injuries was more challenging. On particularly cold days, Marcus experienced aching in his hands and feet where frostbite damage had occurred. He managed this with medication, careful temperature management, and acceptance that some discomfort would be part of his life going forward. But perhaps the most profound changes were psychological. Marcus approached life with a different perspective now. He called his family regularly, made time for relationships, and stopped treating every moment as preparation for the next adventure. Having faced death, he developed a deeper appreciation for ordinary, peaceful existence. "I used to think the meaning of life was out there," Marcus told Dr. Cho during one of their final therapy sessions. "In the next photograph, the next expedition, the next achievement. Now I understand that meaning is right here, in connections with people, in contributing to others' safety and growth, in being present for ordinary moments. Dr. Cho smiled. That's a common evolution for trauma survivors. Confronting mortality can paradoxically make life feel more precious and immediate. You've done remarkable psychological work over this past year. The anniversary of his rescue was approaching, and Marcus decided to commemorate it by returning to the tree that had saved him. This time, he brought Emily, his parents, Amy and her family, and the key members of the rescue team who had saved his life. Standing beneath the old spruce, Marcus felt overwhelming emotion. The tree looked different in summer, green and vital, its branches swaying gently in the warm breeze. It was hard to imagine the ice-covered, storm-battered version that had been his refuge. This tree, Marcus said to the assembled group, represents something important to me. It's a reminder that solutions can come from unexpected places, that survival sometimes means doing the illogical thing, that nature can be both destroyer and savior. Captain Walsh, the helicopter pilot, studied the tree with professional interest. Looking at it now, in summer, it's remarkable that you spotted this as a potential shelter during a blizzard. The problem-solving you demonstrated under that level of stress, it's extraordinary. Marcus's father placed a hand on his son's shoulder. We're proud of you, not just for surviving, but for what you've done with the experience. You've turned trauma into teaching, near death into meaning. The group spent several hours at the site, taking photographs, sharing stories, and simply being present. Marcus climbed partway up the tree.